out on the ragged edge of the Alberta foothills, where the land stops pretending to be gentle, and the wind carries the cold all the way down from the Rockies without apology. Five brothers carved out a life that most men wouldn't have lasted a winter in. They sent east for brides. What the train delivered was something none of them had bargained for: four sisters bound by blood, by grief, and by a secret that had already gotten one man killed. The winter of 1897 had been the kind that broke things: fences, horses, men. The Drummond Ranch sat at the base of a long, sloping valley 20 miles north of Pincher Creek, a sprawling complex of log buildings and stone outbuildings that spoke to 3 generations of stubborn labor. The five Drummond brothers had wintered there, as they always did, working, arguing, eating in silence, and slowly going mad in the particular way that isolated men do when they go too long without the company of anyone who doesn't share their blood. It was Gareth Drummond, the eldest, who said enough first. He was 37, iron-shouldered, with the kind of face that had never been described as warm, but had always been described as honest. He brought it up at supper, on a Tuesday in February, the wind rattling the window panes, and the lamp throwing long shadows across the table. He said they needed wives. He said it the way he said most things, without ceremony and without apology. Cass, the second brother, who had come back from a logging accident 3 years prior, with 2 fingers missing on his left hand and a permanent wariness in his dark eyes, simply set down his fork and nodded. Prentice, the third, who was quick-tongued and had a laugh that could fill a barn, whistled low and said he hadn't thought Gareth had it in him. Gareth told him to be quiet. Stellan, the fourth, a reader and a thinker, who seemed perpetually out of place in a man's body built for hauling and splitting, said nothing but folded the corner of his book down deliberately, which was his version of full attention. Niall, the youngest at 24, just looked up from his plate and said, "About time." Gareth had already written to a placement agency in Toronto called the Hearthstone Correspondence Society. He had submitted 5 profiles, one for each of them, with specific descriptions of what each man required. For himself, he wrote that he needed a woman of sound practical sense, one who would not be surprised by hard work or hard weather. For Cass, who never would have written it himself, he requested a woman of patience and steadiness, someone unbothered by silence. For Prentice, someone lively, because anything quieter would bore him to cruelty within a month. For Stellan, a woman of some education or at least genuine curiosity. For Niall, only that she be kind, because Niall was the kind of man who would do best with kindness. Months passed. Letters went back and forth. The agency confirmed 5 matches: a bookkeeper named Harriet Aldous from Ottawa, a dressmaker named Nell Farrow from Hamilton, a former teacher named Blythe Emerson from Kingston, a farmer's daughter named June, just June, from a small town outside of Guelph, and a woman named Adela White, listed only as a widow from Montreal. On the agreed morning in early June, all 5 Drummond brothers rode the wagon down to the Pincher Creek train station. They were an arresting sight. 5 large men in canvas and wool, smelling of horses and wood smoke, filling the narrow platform with their combined presence, while the townspeople found reasons to study their boots. The eastbound train came in late and loud, steaming into the station in a billow of hot iron and coal smoke. Gareth stood at the front of the group, his hat pulled low, watching the passenger cars. The first woman stepped off the train. She was tall and carried herself with a composed, deliberate quality, her dark hair pinned beneath a dove-gray hat. She scanned the platform with green eyes that took in the 5 brothers without flinching and without any particular warmth either. She was Harriet Aldous, the bookkeeper, or so the manifest claimed. The second woman followed her closely, auburn-haired, moving with a softer step, her eyes drifting toward the mountains on the horizon, with a look that was either wonder or fear, and perhaps both. Nell Farrow, the dressmaker. The third came out fast, already talking to someone behind her, gesturing with an impatient hand. Her hair was the same dark shade as the first woman's, pinned less carefully. Blythe Emerson, the teacher. The fourth emerged slowly, clutching a cloth bag to her chest, a small woman with reddish gold hair and the watchful stillness of someone who had learned that being small in a large world required careful attention. June. And then the fifth. She was the last to step from the car, and she came out with the deliberate slowness of someone who had been dreading the arrival. Dark-haired, like the first and the third, with green eyes so like Harriet's they were unsettling. Adela White, the widow from Montreal. Gareth was not a man who missed things. He had spent 3 decades reading weather and livestock and terrain. He looked at the 5 women standing on the platform, the matching line of their shoulders, the identical subtle tilt of their chins, the way they unconsciously angled their bodies toward one another, and he understood before any of them said a word. He stepped forward. "You're not 5 strangers," he said. It was Harriet who answered him. She stepped forward without hesitation, her green eyes meeting his directly. "No, Mr. Drummond, we are not." She straightened her hat with one gloved hand. "I am Harriet Colquhoun. These are my sisters, Nell, Blythe, June, and Adela. Our family name is Colquhoun. We paid the agency to list us under separate surnames and submit our applications to the same address." Prentice let out a sharp, incredulous sound. "There are 5 of us and 5 of you, and you expect us to believe that's coincidence?" "It isn't coincidence," Harriet said evenly. "It was planning." Cass had not said anything. He was watching the youngest one, June, who had not looked up since the moment of revelation, her fingers white around the strap of her bag. "You entered contracts under false names," Gareth said. "We entered contracts under shortened names," Harriet replied, and there was a precision to hers that suggested she had been a bookkeeper, for real, whatever else was or wasn't true. "Harriet Aldous is my mother's maiden name. I did not invent it. But you are correct that we were not fully transparent, and I won't pretend otherwise." She paused. "If you wish to send us back on the next train east, I understand, but I would ask you to hear why we came." Gareth looked at his brothers. Cass was still watching June. Prentice had crossed his arms but hadn't said anything else. Stellan had the expression he wore when he was trying to work something out. Niall was looking at Adela, the widow, who had still not raised her eyes from the platform boards. "Load the trunks," Gareth told Prentice. He turned back to Harriet. "The ride takes 2 hours. It's not a smooth one. I suggest you be honest with me before we get there, because I do not like discovering things about my own household from other people." She looked at him steadily. "Then we have something in common, Mr. Drummond." The wagon north was made mostly in silence, the kind of silence that carries weight. The foothills rose ahead of them, the pale peaks of the Rockies gleaming beyond, still snow-capped even in June. The road was rutted and occasionally treacherous where spring runoff had carved new channels across it. The sisters sat together in the wagon bed, close but not clinging. 5 women who had clearly spent their lives in proximity to one another and knew how to take up space without crowding. Gareth drove the team at the front, Harriet seated beside him on the bench at his insistence. He did not make small talk. She did not seem to expect any. Behind them, the pairings were already quietly beginning to take shape in the way that these things do, not from arrangement but from gravity. Cass rode alongside the wagon on his gray gelding, keeping pace near where June sat. She had finally let go of her bag enough to brace her hands against the wagon's side slats as the road roughened. She was watching everything, the hawks circling above the coulees, the yellow wildflowers along the ditch, with an intensity that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite joy, but was something hovering between them. Cass, who communicated primarily through observation, noticed that she looked at living things with the particular attention of someone who had been recently reminded that they were not permanent. He didn't say anything. He simply guided his horse a half-length closer to her side of the wagon when the road narrowed near a drop. She noticed. She didn't say anything either. But she looked at his hand on the reins, the 2-fingered left hand, without flinching, which told him something he filed away carefully. Prentice had attached himself to Blythe within minutes, managing to make her argue with him about the pronunciation of a French place name before they had cleared the edge of town. Blythe gave as good as she got, which delighted him enormously. He kept trying to provoke her, and she kept refusing to be provoked in the way he expected, which meant he had to keep trying new approaches. He had never looked so entertained in his life. Stellan rode quietly at the rear. Nell had ended up beside him in the wagon when the seating arranged itself, and he had offered her his jacket when the wind picked up crossing the open flat, the way a man does when he's been raised right and doesn't think about it. She had accepted it with a quiet thank you, and then after a moment asked what he was reading. She had seen the corner of a book spine in his coat pocket, he told her. She said she had read it and thought the third chapter was the best one. He had not been able to contain the slight widening of his eyes, and she had smiled without letting him see it quite. Adela sat alone at the front of the wagon bed, not apart by distress, but by a kind of quiet self-containment. Niall rode nearby, but did not intrude. He was 24, and he had good instincts about people, which meant he understood that the widow was not ready to be talked at, so he simply stayed close enough that she was not alone without requiring her to acknowledge him. Once, when the wagon hit a bad rut and she grabbed for the side and missed, his hand was there to steady her arm before she had even registered the lurch. She looked up at him. He just nodded and let go. She looked back at the road ahead, but some of the tightness around her eyes had softened. The Drummond homestead announced itself before they could see it. First, the smell of wood smoke and cut pine, then the long fence-line of split rails marking the pasture, then the buildings themselves rising out of the valley in the late afternoon light. It was a working ranch, not a polished one, but it was solid and extensive, and showed the marks of people who had built to last rather than to impress. A stone house with thick walls and small windows, a barn that was older than the house, a cookhouse, a smokehouse, a tool shed, a granary. Dogs sleeping in the yard who lifted their heads and then stood and then began to bark as the wagon came in. Inside, the house smelled the way houses do when 5 men have lived in them alone for too long, serviceable but spare, firewood and leather and the ghost of every meal eaten there, clean enough, utterly without softness. The sisters huddled near the kitchen hearth while the brothers brought in the trunks. The weight of their situation was settling in. The reality of the Alberta foothills, the 2 hours of empty land behind them. The 5 massive strangers they were bound to by contract. Supper was elk and potatoes and bread that Prentice had made, which was better than expected. Blythe said so, and Prentice looked unreasonably pleased. Gareth ate without speaking. Harriet watched him eat without speaking, and seemed to find this satisfactory rather than troubling, which interested him. After supper, Gareth stood. He told his brothers to show the women to the guest rooms. Then he looked at Harriet. "Stay," he said. Nell reached for Harriet's arm as the others rose. Harriet touched her sister's hand briefly. A private reassurance, a whole conversation in a fraction of a second, and stayed. When the others had gone, Gareth sat back down across the table from her. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the wind had come up from the northwest, the particular cold Alberta wind that carries the mountains in it. He looked at her for a long moment. "Women don't plan that carefully," he said, "unless they have to." Harriet set her hands flat on the table. She had small, ink-stained hands, which confirmed the bookkeeper part at least. "Our father was Alistair Colquhoun," she began. "He was a shipping factor out of Montreal. A good man. A careful man, mostly, except for one very bad decision." She paused. "He borrowed money from a man named Devereux Voss. You may not know that name out here. In Montreal, in the right circles, or the wrong ones, everyone knows it. Voss runs import-export concerns, which is a polite way of saying he controls what moves through the port and who profits from it and who doesn't. He is not a person who makes loans out of generosity. He makes them because debt is leverage, and he collects on it in ways that don't appear in any ledger." Gareth said nothing. He waited. "My father borrowed against his contracts to expand his warehouse operation. Harriet continued. The contracts fell through. The warehouse flooded. He couldn't repay. For 3 years, Voss collected in other ways. Information, influence. My father's signature on documents he didn't fully understand. And then last autumn, Voss decided that wasn't sufficient anymore. Her voice remained steady, but her hands had tightened slightly on the table. He came to our house in October. He told my father that the debt would be settled in a single arrangement. He had 4 sons, men, more accurately, men of his particular character, and he proposed that each of his sons take one of us. Not in marriage, not in any sense that involved our consent. Gareth's jaw had gone hard. My father refused. Harriet's voice dropped, not from weakness, but from the particular quietness that surrounds a terrible thing. So Voss had him beaten, severely. My father died 3 days later, without regaining consciousness. We were in the house when it happened. They made sure of that. She lifted her eyes to Gareth's. Voss sent a message afterward. He gave us 2 weeks. The kitchen was very quiet except for the fire. We had Adela's inheritance. Her late husband left her a small amount. Enough. We liquidated what we could. We paid the agency, arranged the manifests, took different trains from different stations so we couldn't be tracked leaving together, and arrived in Pincher Creek on the same train only because we had to at the end. She exhaled once. We used shorter surnames because Colquhoun is distinctive. We hoped the distance would be enough, but I want to be honest with you, Mr. Drummond, because you strike me as a man who deserves it. She looked at him directly. Devereux Voss is not a person who accepts no for an answer. He has money, and he has men, and he has pride, which is perhaps the most dangerous of the 3. He will send people looking for us. I don't know when, but I believe it is a matter of when and not whether. I have brought trouble to your house, and I am sorry for it, and if you want us gone in the morning, I will find another way. Gareth looked at her for a long time. He got up. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark Alberta night, the stars vast and cold above the ridge. Then he turned back. This is Drummond land, he said. Nobody comes onto it and takes what belongs here. He said it the way he said everything, without ceremony. But Harriet understood that it was a promise. What followed was 3 weeks of a particular kind of vigilant domestic life, the kind that happens when people are preparing for something, while also, almost involuntarily, beginning to build something. Gareth did not panic. He drilled. He assessed the property's defensive realities with the same systematic attention he gave to crop planning and fence repair. He spent mornings with Harriet going over the ranch's geography, the approaches, the sight lines, the natural choke points. She turned out to have a precise analytical mind that took to tactical thinking with unsettling ease. She asked good questions. She remembered everything he told her. By the end of the first week, she could load and fire a rifle accurately at 30 yards, and by the end of the second, she was hitting twice that. Between them, something was growing that neither of them named. It had no romance in it yet. That came later, but it had the foundation that romance requires, genuine respect, the particular attention that 2 careful people pay to each other when they have decided the other is worth attending to, and a shared daily reality that stripped away everything but character. Gareth had not known what to do with a woman who thought the way Harriet thought. He found he didn't want to do without it. In the barn, Cass and June found each other in the way that quiet people do, which is slowly and without announcement. June had taken it upon herself to help with the horses, not because anyone asked, but because she was the kind of person who identified what needed doing and did it. Cass came in one morning to find her already there, brushing down his gray gelding with the patient thoroughness of someone who had done this before and found it settling. He didn't say anything. He picked up a brush and started on the other side. They worked like that for an hour before June said, almost to the horse, "He doesn't mind strangers." "No," Cass said. "He's got good sense about people." A pause. "He let me touch his bad leg," she said. The gelding had an old tendon injury that made him wary of handling on that side. Cass looked at her across the horse's back. He doesn't let me touch that leg half the time. June almost smiled. It was a small, careful thing. But it was real. He thought about what Gareth had said when he came back from the logging accident, missing his fingers, certain no woman would want what was left. Gareth had said, "The right one will look at what's there, not what's missing." Cass had not believed him then. He was beginning to reconsider. Prentice and Blythe argued about everything with the specific pleasure of two people who have finally found someone who fights back properly. She refused to be charmed, and this made him work harder to charm her, which produced the effect of making him genuinely interesting instead of merely entertaining. She was a former schoolteacher, and she had a schoolteacher's iron resistance to being managed, which Prentice found he had needed all his life without knowing it. Their rides together, he had started taking her out on horseback to see the foothills country she'd read about but never seen, were exercises in simultaneous bickering and wonder. He kept trying to catch her in a moment of pure, unguarded joy, and she kept letting him catch her but pretending she hadn't. Stellan and Nell discovered they were reading the same book. He had started it after she mentioned the third chapter, and one evening she came into the sitting room to find her copy missing and him deeply into it. She sat down across from him and waited. He looked up and then, to his own slight surprise, read her the passage he had been in the middle of, rather than apologizing. She listened, then she told him what she thought. They talked until the lamp burned low, and both of them forgot to be self-conscious about the fact that they had somehow arrived at genuine conversation in the space of a few evenings. Niall simply stayed near Adela, patient as weather. She was 29, the eldest after Harriet, in some ways that had nothing to do with birth order. She had buried a husband 2 years prior, and was still carrying that particular weight. The kind that isn't grief exactly anymore, but is something grief leaves behind. Niall didn't try to move it. He just made sure she was never alone without wanting to be, which is a different thing. One evening he found her sitting on the stone step behind the cookhouse, watching the last light go off the mountains. He sat down beside her without asking. After a long while she said quietly, "It's very different here than Montreal, than anywhere I've been." He nodded. The mountains were going purple and then dark. "Does it get easier?" she asked. "The country, I mean." "It gets familiar," he said. "That's different from easier, but it's something." She considered this. "That's honest." "I try to be." She looked at him sideways, briefly, then back at the mountains, but she didn't move away. The peace lasted exactly 18 days. The ranch dogs went up in the night. Not the usual acknowledgement of a deer or a coyote, but the full, frantic alarm of something genuinely wrong. Gareth was at the window with his rifle before the sound registered in his waking mind. Through the blue dark before dawn, he counted 3 horses on the south trail. He had the brothers up in 2 minutes. The rider who came in under a white flag was a man from Pincher Creek named Aldous Webb, a constable Gareth had known for years. Webb was gray-faced in the early light, and his horse was hard-used, coat still dark with sweat. Gareth stepped off the porch, rifle resting in the crook of his arm, not raised but not casual either. "Aldous, you're a long way up the valley." Webb pulled up and took his hat off, which was not a good sign. "Gareth, I'd have come faster, but I didn't know until yesterday." He looked past Gareth to where Harriet had appeared in the doorway. He grimaced. "There are men in town. Arrived day before yesterday on the Calgary train. 8 of them, well-dressed, well-armed, which is a combination that doesn't mean anything good out here. They've been asking about women. Auburn hair, dark hair, 4 or 5 of them together, offering good money for information." Harriet had gone very still. "Who's running them?" Gareth asked. "Man named Larkin. Eugene Larkin. I know the name from my time in Calgary. He works for an outfit out of Montreal, does recovery work for a man named Voss." Webb met Gareth's eyes. "Gareth, this Larkin isn't the type to negotiate. He carried a warrant, but I've seen the paper and it's Montreal issue. No territorial weight to it, and I'd bet my badge it was purchased. He's been in the saloon telling anyone who'll listen that he's authorized to use whatever means are necessary. He hesitated. He also said something about the women's family, Gareth, about making an example. Cass had appeared behind Gareth, his expression entirely flat. Stellan stood in the doorway behind Harriet. Prentice and Niall came around the side of the house from the direction of the barn. "When are they coming?" Gareth asked. "They know where the ranch is." Someone at the train station talked. They described the wagon and Prentice's horse, the roan, very specifically. "I figure you have until dark at the earliest. Maybe not that long." Webb looked uncomfortable with his own next words. "There's one more thing. Larkin has been making inquiries about the territorial magistrate. He seems to know that Magistrate Fowler in Pincher Creek has been cooperating with outside interests. If the women try to go to the law in town, Larkin may already have that covered." Gareth turned to look at Harriet. She was already thinking. He could see it in the set of her face, not panic but calculation, the same quality she brought to every problem he had watched her work through. "The root cellar," Gareth started. "No," Harriet said. He looked at her. "Not this time." She came down the porch steps. "Blythe can shoot better than any of your brothers except you. She grew up on a farm, and her father was a hunter. Nell was a dressmaker for 8 years in Hamilton, and her hands are steadier than mine. Adela knows how Voss operates, how his men think, what they expect. They expect women who hide." Her gray-green eyes were clear and hard. "They will not expect what they find here." Gareth looked at her for a long moment. The ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile crossed his face. "All right, Miss Colquhoun, let's see what they find." Larkin's men came at midnight. There was no moon to speak of, just a white-black sky and the cold Alberta wind. Gareth had positioned his brothers. Cass on the roof of the barn with a long rifle. Stellan in the loft with sight lines to both the south trail and the house door. Prentice and Niall flanking the main yard from the granary and the tool shed. The women were inside the house, and they were not hidden. Harriet and Gareth were at the front window together, the same way they had run their morning drills, shoulder to shoulder in the dark. She was steady, he noticed. The first indication was the dogs going quiet again, which was worse than the barking. Then the shapes of men on horseback, materializing out of the dark like bad ideas. They came fast once they moved. 6 men charging the yard on horseback, 2 more coming around the back of the barn on foot, all of them counting on the kind of violence that speed produces before anyone has time to respond. What they met instead was a coordinated defense from 8 people who had spent 3 weeks preparing for exactly this. Cass's first shot from the barn roof took one of the horsemen's hats off, a deliberate near miss, a warning that landed with the force of a statement about range and accuracy. The charge broke apart instantly. Horses wheeled. Men shouted. Prentice opened up from the granary, driving 2 riders back toward the south trail. The 2 men who had come around the barn on foot found themselves suddenly confronted by Stellan, dropping from the loft doorway directly into their path, and, in the chaos of that, the advantage of surprise shifted entirely. Inside the house, the rear window shattered. One man came through the frame, large, purposeful, clearly Larkin's specialist for close work. He had a revolver raised before he cleared the sill. Nell shot him. She used Gareth's secondary rifle from the kitchen doorway. Both hands on the stock, completely steady, the way she was steady at everything that required care. She didn't kill him, she caught him in the shoulder, which put him down and kept him there. Blythe had the back door barred before another man could follow. In the main room, June had taken up a position by the side window and was watching the yard with the same fierce, total concentration she gave to horses and to living things. Adela was beside her, and Adela, who had said almost nothing about what she knew of Voss's methods, had known to watch for a specific thing. A man who didn't charge with the others. A man who stayed back and directed. She had been watching for him since the attack began. "There," she said quietly, pointing. At the edge of the tree line, a figure on horseback that hadn't moved, Larkin, watching, waiting to see what survived before he committed to the property himself. Gareth saw him a moment later from the front window. He handed Harriet the rifle he had been holding and looked at her. She shook her head. 60 yards in the dark, I know. He pulled his coat on. Gareth, I know, he said again, which was not the same as conceding the point. He was out the front door before she could finish the argument. What happened next was not clean or simple, or the way it appears in stories. Gareth crossed the yard in the dark, using the chaos of the retreating riders as cover, and he reached Larkin before Larkin reached the tree line. There was a struggle, brutal and brief, and conducted mostly in silence, except for the sounds men make when they are fighting hard. Larkin was quick and experienced, and he had a knife. The shot that finally ended it came from the porch. Harriet had followed him outside. 60 yards in the dark, she had said, and she had been honest about the difficulty of it. She wasn't honest about whether she intended to try. She hit Larkin in the gun arm at the moment he had the revolver leveled at Gareth's chest. Not a killing shot, but it was enough. Larkin went down. The remaining men, leaderless and taking fire from all directions, broke for the tree line and didn't come back. The yard went quiet except for the wind and the dogs, and the sound of men breathing after hard things. Gareth stood in the middle of the yard and looked back at the house, at the figure on the porch with the rifle. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked back. When he reached the porch, she said, I told you 60 yards in the dark. You did, he said. I also hit him. You did, he said again. He was bleeding from a cut on his forearm, where the knife had found him, and... She looked at it, and then looked at his face, and did not look away. And he understood then that they were not going to have a simple life, but that they were going to have a real one, which was better. Inside, Cass was already being fussed over for a graze on his ribs that he was minimizing, and June was not allowing him to minimize. Prentice had a split lip and was showing it to Blythe with theatrical tragedy, and she was trying not to laugh, which meant she was laughing. Stellan and Nell sat together at the kitchen table while she cleaned a cut above his brow with the steady hands she brought to everything, neither of them speaking, which was its own kind of conversation. Niall was whole and already tending to one of the ranch dogs that had caught a graze. Adela was beside him, helping without being asked. In the morning, Webb rode up from town. Larkin was alive and in custody, but the larger problem remained. 8 men was not the extent of Voss's reach, and what had been done on the ranch would reach Montreal within the week. You need the law, Webb said, but not Magistrate Fowler. Harriet had been waiting for this. She went back to her trunk. From the interior lining, where it had ridden all the way from Montreal in a false panel she had constructed herself, sewing the cover with the precision of a woman who had planned for this moment, she produced a leather document case. Inside were copies she had made, in her own hand, of Voss's account books. 3 months before her father's death, she had understood that Alistair Colquhoun was going to lose. She had used her access as his bookkeeper to copy every record she could reach, the names of bought officials, the payments to Port Authority inspectors, the coded references to federal trade commissioners receiving regular retainers. She had not told her sisters. She had not told anyone. She had simply done what a good bookkeeper does with information she cannot yet use. She kept it safe and she waited. There's a federal circuit judge, Webb said slowly, reading what she showed him. Harvey Crane. He came out from Ottawa 3 months ago to oversee the territorial court reorganization. He hasn't been here long enough to be bought. He looked up at Harriet. If you can get this to him before Voss can make contact. We can get it to him, Gareth said. Harriet looked at him. Crane is in Calgary, then we ride to Calgary. He said it the way he said everything. They did not go quietly. Gareth and Harriet rode directly. Prentice and Blythe took the southern approach into Calgary by a different road, riding in ahead as a distraction. 2 people of obvious energy and apparent aimlessness who walked into the largest hotel's dining room and immediately began a loud, engrossing argument about railway timetables that drew every idle ear in the room and kept them there for 45 minutes. They were very good at this. Cass and Stellan secured the perimeter of the courthouse building, while Niall and June and Adela maintained a watched position on the streets approaching it, watching for any of Larkin's associates who might have come ahead by wire. Inside the courthouse, Gareth and Harriet moved quickly through the building's long corridors toward the judge's chambers. They were within sight of the door when a voice behind them said, "Miss Colquhoun, I expected you'd surface eventually." He was a lean, silver-haired man in a very good suit that had no business being in Alberta, and he held himself with the particular authority of someone who was accustomed to having people stop walking when he spoke. "My name is Renaud. I represent Mr. Voss's interests in this matter." He smiled without warmth. "You have something that belongs to him, and I'm afraid you've caused a considerable disruption. Mr. Voss is a patient man with a long memory. Give me the documents and we can resolve this without any further difficulty for you or for these good people you've involved." He had two men flanking him. Harriet looked at Gareth. A brief look, the look of two people who have developed, in 3 weeks of hard necessity, a shared language. She turned back to Renaud. "I don't have the documents," she said. Renaud's expression didn't change. "Miss Colquhoun, I have copies," she said. "The originals are already with Judge Crane. They were delivered this morning by Constable's escort, which Constable Webb arranged before we left Pincher Creek." She tilted her head. "Did Larkin not mention that possibility when you communicated?" "He should have. It was the obvious counter-move." The color did not drain from Renaud's face so much as it simply went somewhere else. Gareth had put himself between Harriet and the two flanking men without making a production of it. The two men looked at each other, and then at Renaud, and then made the practical calculation of men who are being paid for specific work and have realized the specific work is no longer available. From down the corridor came the sound of boots, firm, official, the sound of the law when it has not been purchased. Judge Harvey Crane was a square-shouldered man from Ontario, with the face of someone who had been sent west, specifically because he was not interested in being charmed, pressured, or bought. He had received the documents that morning. He had spent 4 hours with them. His expression as he came down the corridor was that of a man who has been looking for an opportunity and has found one rather larger than expected. Renaud was arrested before he cleared the building. The consequences moved fast, the way they do when a federal judge has clear documentation and the political will to act on it. By telegraph, by warrant, by the slow grinding machinery of Dominion authority, Devereux Voss's operations in Montreal were raided within a fortnight. The Port Authority inspectors were removed. The federal commissioners, whose names appeared in Harriet's copies, were investigated. Voss himself was arrested in his own offices by federal marshals and charged with corruption, extortion, and conspiracy in the death of Alistair Colquhoun. It took time. It was not clean or simple, but it was done. Summer came fully to the Alberta foothills, and the Drummond Ranch was at peace in a way it had not been since before the long winter. The dogs slept in the yard again. The horses had been moved to the summer pasture. The mountains were green below the snow line, and the air smelled of sweet grass and warming stone. The ceremony was held outdoors on a Sunday morning in July, a minister coming up from Pincher Creek in a good mood and no particular hurry. There was no stagecoach. There were no secrets. 5 couples stood together in the long, morning light, while the foothills country spread out around them in every direction, enormous and indifferent and entirely beautiful. Harriet and Gareth stood facing each other, the iron-steady woman who had kept a secret in a dress lining for 3 months, and the rancher who had made one promise and kept it absolutely. When he kissed her, she felt, for the first time since October, that the ground was solid under her feet, and intended to stay that way. Cass and June stood side by side, her hand in his 2-fingered left hand, without self-consciousness on either part, 2 quiet people who had found in each other something they had not known they needed until it was there. Prentice and Blythe exchanged their vows with the energy of people who have been in a prolonged and enjoyable disagreement and have decided to make it official. She told him afterward that his bread had been the best thing about arriving. He pretended to be offended. She didn't believe him, and he didn't expect her to. Stellan and Nell stood close, her hand in the crook of his arm, both of them watching the mountains as the minister spoke, and it seemed to both of them that this was simply a ceremony for something that had already quietly become true weeks ago, somewhere between chapters. And Niall and Adela stood a little apart from the others, not from distance, but from the particular privacy that two people who have found each other slowly require. He had not rushed her. She had found, in the unhurried space he offered, something she had not expected to find again, the simple desire to stay somewhere. When she said yes, she meant yes to the mountains and the cold wind and the long, hard work of a ranch in the foothills, and to a young man with good instincts and the patience to use them. She meant it completely. The Rockies stood above it all, indifferent and enormous and absolutely permanent, the way wild country is, unmoved by what happens in the valley below, but present for all of it, a witness that asks nothing and forgets nothing. The Drummond brothers had sent east for strangers and received instead a family. 5 women who had run toward the edge of the known world and found that it held them. The country was hard, and it would stay hard, and none of them were foolish enough to believe otherwise. But they had built something that the wind and the men and the long, dark winters would not move. And that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.